Hey everyone, welcome on this Tuesday night, September 17th. And tonight we're going to be talking about the Constitution and basically really what you need to know about the Constitution to really be successful for the rest of the year in AP Gov. So basically the plan is to look at what each of the articles of the Constitution talk about, as well as the overarching principles. So all of these articles you'll end up talking about way more in depth in your courses this year, and so will we later on in the year on Fiveable. But right now, what's important for you to understand is as you begin your AP Gov course is really what do each of those articles actually stand for? What's the gist of what they're talking about in those articles, and what are the principles that really guide our Constitution? So let's dive in here. So just a quick reminder, if you always want to know when the next AP Gov stream is going to be, or if you're in another AP class and you want to know when those streams are going to be, we promote those on Twitter, we promote them on Instagram and on YouTube. You just follow us, excuse me if I can speak tonight, via Think Fiveable, and you'll find us at all those places. So just a FYI on some things that are coming up here. This Thursday on the 19th at 7 p.m., these times are all Eastern Standard Time. If you're struggling with Federalist 10, Federalist 51, or Brutus 1, which are all foundational documents that you must know for the AP exam, we're going to do a stream. One of my co-teachers is going to be doing a stream with you on what the language is of those things, why they're important, and really what do you need to know about that. So that's coming up this Thursday. Next week, we have a big week. In fact, I don't even have all the streams on here that are coming up next week. So you definitely want to be following along on Fiveable to see those. But just a couple things to keep in mind. On Monday at 7 p.m., we have one on Introduction to Federalism, some of the major things that you need to understand about federalism, and we'll be diving more into that with other streams later in the week. On Monday night at 8 p.m., an hour later, we'll be doing an in-depth look at the Declaration of Independence. Why? Because it is also a foundational document that's highly tested on the AP test. And then Tuesday on the 24th at 7 p.m., I'm going to be back on with you again, and I'm going to be doing the powers. Because the powers are the thing that seem to confuse students the most. Expressed, implied, concurrent, reserved, and all denied. All are powers that people tend to get jumbled up in their head, especially that implied one from the necessary and proper clause. So I'm going to literally take a whole hour with you just to go over those things, because I'm sure a lot of you get those mixed around in your head. So let's keep on going. So what are we doing tonight? Okay. We're just giving you your intro. We're going to dive into each of the articles of the Constitution. I'm just going to do those straight in order, and then we're going to go over the principles of the Constitution. At any point, as always, if you have any questions, please just say something in the chat box there. I will be more than happy to stop the train, to answer whatever question you have, and make sure that you are clear on those things. Because, you know, I passed the AP Gov test a long time ago. I'm here for you guys to make sure that you are successful on the AP Gov test. So let's begin. So let's talk about Article 1, okay? Article 1 of the Constitution, of the 7 articles in the Constitution, covers the legislative branch, okay? So before I dive into this, I actually have a question for you all. Why do you think the framers made the legislative branch Article 1? Or let's start again. Why do you think the framers made the legislative branch Article 1? I'll give you a second to type a thought that maybe you have there in the chat box. Why do you think the framers made Article 1 the legislative branch? Any thought will be fine. No right or wrong answers. Everybody's quiet tonight. Okay, so I see someone asking, does it have to do with the Great Compromise? That's a really good guess, okay? Because the Great Compromise does deal with Article 1, but that's not the reason that they put it as the first article. But I like your thinking there, because that is a good guess. At least you're in the right ballpark. Okay, so for those of you that maybe don't know, The reason that they put the legislative branch as Article 1 is because really that is the most representative of all the branches of the people themselves. And they felt that in a republic, which is the type of government they established in the Constitution, that it really is the people who have the power, okay? And we're going to talk about that as one of our principles here in just a little bit. And as a result, the people's branch, meaning the legislative branch or Congress, is most important to the keeping of our republic, okay, to the keeping of our democracy. And so that's why they put the legislative branch first. A lot of times people will say, you know, what branch is the most powerful? And a lot of people, if they've never had a government course before, they'll say, well, I think the presidency and Article 2 is the most powerful because they see the president in the news all the time. But really, those branches are kind of co-equal in power. But what I would say is that the founders definitely gave some advantages to the legislative branch because it really is the stopgap for many things. Why? Because it's the people's branch. And even if you just look at the length of the Constitution, like in my classroom, I wish I had a picture. In my classroom, I have a giant version of the Constitution, okay? And if you look at the length of Article 1 compared to the rest of the Constitution, Article 1 is almost the same length as the whole rest of the Constitution combined. And so it's really important. So now that you understand that, let's talk about the Article 1 in the legislative branch and some of the things that you need to understand there. So Article 1 establishes a bicameral legislature, okay? And words that are really important here, I've bolded for you in this PowerPoint. So what does that mean? Well, that's just a fancy word for a two-house legislature, okay? The House of Representatives and the Senate. And so one of you just said a couple minutes ago about the Great Compromise. Well, this is the result of the Great Compromise at the Constitutional Convention. And if you're struggling with those compromises, don't worry, because we have a stream coming up next week on those as well, too. So you can check that out if you're struggling with the Constitutional Convention. So that Great Compromise took the Virginia Plan, which was calling for representation based on population, and the New Jersey Plan, which was calling for representation that would be equal for the states. Why? Because think about their populations, okay? And basically it combined it. And it said, okay, we're going to establish a bicameral legislature. At the lower house would be the House of Representatives. And that house is going to be, representation is going to be determined by population. So if you live, for example, actually, you know what? Let me just, this is a little thing. Write in the chat, what state do you live in? What state do you live in? Just go ahead and write it in the chat here, because I'm just going to use those as examples. Indiana, okay. Georgia. Oh, you guys are going to make me really think here with some of these. Maryland. I know Maryland because I'm from Maryland. So, any other states there? So, of those states that are listed right now, Indiana, Georgia, Maryland, Indiana is the one that is the most populated, okay? I think Georgia would be the second most populated, and then Maryland, although Maryland and Georgia are probably pretty close in population. So what that means is, of those three states that y'all are from, Indiana would be the one that has the most representatives in the House of Representatives. Why? Because their population's bigger. That's the result of the Great Compromise. Now, on the upper house, the Senate, the representation is equal among the states. So every state, no matter if you're from Indiana, from Georgia, from Maryland, Alaska, Hawaii, wherever, every state gets 2 senators, okay? Which makes it really easy math for us, because if there are 50 states and every state gets 2 senators, there are 100 members of the Senate, okay? Now, if we add a new state at some point in time, then there'll be 102 members. But we created that bicameral legislature where the House is based on population and the Senate is based on equality among the states. Also in Article 1 is a really important subsection. And maybe you've already talked about this in your government classes, but if not, okay, you definitely will be, and I definitely will be in my stream next week. Article 1, Section 8 is probably one of the most contested parts of Article 1. And Article 1, Section 8 is the place in the article that lists the expressed, or another word is enumerated, powers. It just means there are the powers given to Congress that are directly expressed or directly written in the Constitution. So I gave you some examples here. In Article 1, Section 8, you could find where Congress has the power to tax. You could find where Congress has the power to declare war. You can find where it has the power to regulate commerce, create legislation, create toll roads, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It lists, there's probably 15 altogether, powers that Congress has in Article 1, Section 8. But then at the end of Article 1, Section 8, it says that Congress has the power to make laws that are necessary and proper to the maintenance of the country, okay? And we also call this the elastic clause. Why? Because it's like a rubber band and it stretches the Constitution, okay? So we can imply things from those expressed powers. So a really quick example of this. If Congress has the power to coin and print money, which is one of its express powers in Article 1, Section 8, then we can imply from that they have the power to determine who's going to appear on the $20 bill. If you haven't paid attention, that's something that they've been talking about, and whether or not Harriet Tubman is going to go on that. That's something we implied. It does not say that directly in the Constitution, but the elastic clause allows Congress to stretch its given powers. Now, why did they stick that in there? Well, simply because the framers that sat down at the Constitutional Convention and wrote those knew that they could never possibly think of all the things that Congress would need the power to do. Okay, and so they basically said, well, take what we've given you as the expressed or enumerated powers, and you can stretch those. Okay, you can imply certain things from them. Why? Because they didn't know what an airplane was back then. They didn't know what a car was back then. They had no concept of these things that you and I deal with all the time. And if they would have listed every single power, well, the Constitution would take up books and books and books and books and books, and it doesn't. Okay, so if you're still confused on express versus implied power, don't worry. We've got a stream for that next week, and yours truly will be doing that, and we'll be spending a lot more time on that and going through some specific examples of that. So, Article 2 of the Constitution, okay, is the executive branch, or what you know as the presidency, okay? So, the article itself is shorter than Article 1, and it really just defines the powers of the President of the United States. Okay, one of those being that he is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Now, this is an interesting thing here. So this is another one that I want to throw out to you guys that are watching here. Why do you think that the framers decided to give the president the power to be commander-in-chief instead of a general who served in the military for years and years and years? Why do you think the framers gave the president the power to be commander-in-chief instead of an experienced general? Thoughts on that? Give people a second here just in case they're typing. It's okay. That's why I'm here. So the reason that, okay, wait. Okay, so really good. Okay, that's excellent. Okay, so because the person said it's because it's a person elected by the people. So you're exactly right. Okay, what the framers wanted was they wanted that power over our military to be in the hands of the people. Okay, and not the military, because they worried, using examples from history, that if the military was in charge of the military, that they would get us into wars that we didn't need to get into. Okay, and there are lots of examples that we could go throughout history where, if that was the case, that's exactly what would have happened. So, for example, during World War II, the general that was in charge of the Pacific Front was a man by the name of General Douglas MacArthur. General MacArthur wanted to invade China. And there was some talk there about using nuclear weapons in China. If the military would have been in charge of the military back then and not the president, there's probably a good chance we would have invaded China too, which I don't know would have been the best decision for us to make. So our framers, being worrisome about the military having control over itself, put an elected official, the president, and we call that person the commander-in-chief, over the armed forces, okay? It also says that the president should give a State of the Union address every year. This is typically given in January or in February, and it's when he appears to Congress and basically shares the state of our country with the Congress. Another thing that they give the Congress the power to do, or excuse me, the president the power to do, is to make treaties with other nations. Those are agreements with other nations. Like at the end of wars, we make treaties, but we also make treaties on things that are not war related, like trade, things like that. And then it allows him to appoint officials. But, if you see there, it says with the consent of the Senate. So the president can appoint whoever he wants, okay? But at the end of the day, if the Senate doesn't confirm those appointments, well, they don't get to be appointed, okay? I'll give you a perfect example of that. So when President Obama was leaving office in 2016, just prior to President Trump taking on the office, a Supreme Court justice died, Antonin Scalia. He died unexpectedly. President Obama was still president, and so he appointed Merrick Garland to serve as the replacement. However, the Republicans in the Senate, who controlled the Senate at the time, knew that President Trump was going to be the next president, and so they wanted him to appoint the judge instead of the current president. So they denied the President Obama's appointment. So Merrick Garland never got to sit on the Supreme Court. So that's what I'm saying here, is that that's a check, and we'll talk about that with checks and balances here. The president can appoint officials, but the Senate has to confirm them. Okay, so I see a great question right now. So it says, so would Marbury versus Madison be an example of this? Not of checks and balances, okay? And we're actually going to talk about Marbury versus Madison here in just a little bit. Marbury versus Madison is an example of judicial review, okay? So it deals with the court. So if you just give me like a minute, we're actually going to get to that, okay? But good thinking. So finally, the president, in the Constitution, it says that the president must also take care that the laws are faithfully executed, okay? Basically, that gives the president a lot of implied powers, okay? Similar to what the Congress gets with the necessary and proper clause. So that's Article 2, okay? Now, certainly there's a lot more in here, but what you need to understand right now are the big ideas of these articles. So let's talk about Article 3, which is the judicial branch, okay? So interestingly enough, Article 3 only mentions one court, okay? And that is the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the United States. However, in that same article, it empowers Congress to create inferior courts. What's an inferior court? Inferior just means a lower court, okay? So we have lots of federal courts today because Congress has made other federal courts. Specifically, and I should actually put this up on the slide, but I'll give this to you now. This is a thing that I would write down if you're taking some notes. Congress created the lower courts as well as the Supreme Court as soon as the Constitution was ratified in 1789. One of the very first acts they passed was the Judiciary Act of 1789. I would write that down. The Judiciary Act of 1789, which created the lower court systems or the inferior courts. So, for example, if you get yourself into some type of trouble that deals with the federal government, okay, you're not going straight to the Supreme Court, okay? In fact, let's say that you feel like your rights have been violated in some way and you want to take your case to the Supreme Court. Good luck, Chuck, but it's not happening, okay? You have a very, very, very small chance of that actually happening, okay? Where your case will go, though, is it will go to one of those inferior courts. Specifically, it will go to your federal district courts. There are federal district courts all over the United States. So I live in Maryland. My closest federal district court is in Baltimore. For the one of you that lives in Georgia, your federal court is in Atlanta. Indiana, I don't know if there's one in Indianapolis or not. I'd have to go back and look at the map. But there are federal courts located to you. And then if you don't like the federal district court's decision, you can appeal it to the federal courts of appeal. And then finally, if you don't like their decision, you can appeal it to the Supreme Court, but that doesn't mean that they'll accept that case, okay? So the judicial branch sets up the court system and gives Congress the power to create the inferior courts. Now, relating to what I just said a minute ago with Article 2, the president appoints all federal judges with the approval of the Senate. So every time there's a vacancy on the court, either because A, someone retires, or B, someone dies, okay, then the president gets to appoint their replacement, okay? Judges, because of Article 3, it says judges serve in time or a tenure of good behavior, okay, which in practice really just means life. So as long as you don't do something crazy as a judge, you will get to remain a judge in the federal court system until you just die one day or you decide to retire, okay? So it's kind of a sweet gig because it's a gig that you can keep as long as you want. You don't have to worry about running for election because once you're appointed and you're confirmed by the Senate, you are there. And you are there for as long as you want to be there, okay? Now, have there been judges that have been removed for bad behavior? Yes, okay? Actually, early on in America, like within the first 20 years of American history, we removed a Supreme Court Justice, Samuel Chase. And also, maybe you've been watching the news, there have been news stories in the last 2 days where people, specifically mostly Democrats, have been calling for the impeachment of Justice Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. Why? Because another woman has come forth and said that, when he was younger, he sexually harassed her. And so as a result, there's been calls for his removal, okay? But otherwise, it's pretty rare that a judge is removed from the court. I can't give you a recent example of a judge of any of the federal courts that have been removed. Certainly there's talks of removing people, like I just gave you, but it's very, very, very rare that they actually impeach and remove a judge from the court. So if you're president of the United States for 2 terms, meaning 8 years, well, you have a lot of chance to appoint a lot of people to the court, okay? Because there'll be a lot of people that will retire. Some will die during your tenure, okay? So if we look at that picture of the Supreme Court down here, we can go through and we can see bunches of different presidents that have appointed. So this one here, this is Justice Gorsuch. Justice Gorsuch was appointed by President Trump. He was the first one to be appointed by President Trump. Over here, we have Justice Kavanaugh. He was also appointed by President Trump. Then the 2 ladies in between, this is Justice Sotomayor and Justice Kagan. Both of those were appointed by Barack Obama. Down here in the front row, the Chief Justice who sits here in the middle, that's John Roberts. He was appointed by George W. Bush, probably about the time that most of you are being born, which makes me feel really old, and I'm not really even that old. A couple other ones down here. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was appointed by Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Samuel Alito was appointed by George W. Bush. Clarence Thomas was appointed by George H.W. Bush in the early 1990s. So you get the idea, okay? And that's just Supreme Court. But if we look at the federal court system, you get the same thing. Judges that have been appointed by different judges, and they all serve a very long time. People look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or RBG. She's my favorite. I freaking love Ruth Bader Ginsburg. RBG looks like she's ancient, okay? She's actually only in her 80s, but here's a fun fact for you. She does an incredible workout every day in the gym. Why? Because right above the Supreme Court courtroom is the highest court in the land, meaning the highest basketball court. Yeah, there's a basketball court literally right above the Supreme Court. Anyway, she has a personal trainer, and she does this workout. You can see it on her. There's a documentary they just did about her last year, which is amazing. And she does all these push-ups every day, all these like punches and everything else every day. You can't mess with RBG. She's like magical. So anyways, that's Judicial Branch Article 3. Okay, Article 4 gets into federalism. Okay, now you're gonna spend a whole chapter in in GoPo, okay, on federalism. But what you need to understand now is just really what it is. So federalism is just the relationship that occurs between the states and the national governments. The national government has certain powers and the state government has certain powers. But in this article, it really talks about 3 different things. Okay, number 1, it talks about the full faith and credit clause. Okay, which basically means that any kind of act in a state or judicial proceeding in a state has to be honored in all other states. So I'm going to give you the best example of this, which is one that's usually used in AP Gov, and actually I've seen this tested including an essay in the last 4 years multiple times. The best example of full faith and credit is marriage, okay? So, for example, in the early 2000s, when most of you were being born, some states started to pass gay marriage laws, specifically states in New England. Massachusetts was one of the first ones. Vermont was one of the first ones. Maryland, that legalized gay marriage, okay? Now, at the same time, other states in the country were passing laws that were banning gay marriage. So, for example, at the time, I lived in North Carolina, and North Carolina voted to pass a constitutional amendment to actually ban gay marriage in that state. So what was happening is, let's say that you're a gay couple, okay, and you're married in Maryland, which allowed it in the early 2000s, okay, and then one of your partner, okay, or you get a job in another state. So let's say that you lived in Maryland, you got married in Maryland, you're recognized as Maryland, but then you get a job in Georgia, okay, and Georgia does not recognize gay marriage, okay. Well, according to the full faith and credit clause, they should have. Okay, because the full faith and credit clause says states have to recognize other states' laws, but they didn't, and so that's why it ended up at the Supreme Court in the case Obergefell versus Hodges, where the Supreme Court ruled that laws that banned gay marriage were unconstitutional. Okay, Ashley, I just saw your question here about should we know the article numbers? Yeah, you do want to know the article numbers for the test. So basically, what I tell my students all the time is, if I yell out Article 2, you should be able to yell back to me the executive branch. If I yell out Article 7, you should be able to yell out to me ratification. Because sometimes, a lot of times on the test, they'll just be written as the article and the number. And so you're going, especially with documents, and so you're going to need to know those article numbers. So there's only 7 of them, so it's not too bad. But yeah, you definitely do want to know those. Okay, and then the next one is privileges and immunities, okay? Meaning that a state can't play favorites with their citizens. So this is the example that I give my students, okay? If in the state of, let's take a new state, Texas, okay? They charge their citizens a 2% sales tax rate. Well, if I go to visit my aunt in Texas, but I'm not from Texas, and I go to check out the line, they can't charge me 5% sales tax. They have to charge me the same sales tax, 2%, that they charge their citizens, okay? So that's the privileges and immunities piece. Any privileges or immunities that a state gives to its citizens, it must also give them to all other citizens as well, too. And then the last one is extradition, okay? So in this article in the Constitution, it guarantees that fugitives will be extradited. So this actually plays a really important role where I live at. So I live right on the Maryland-West Virginia border. If you look at a map, I'm like way up on the tip of Maryland, way up in the mountains. So the way this works is, let's say someone robs a bank here in Maryland, but then they go across the river into West Virginia. Well, Maryland police can't follow them to another state, okay? No police can go to another state where they don't have jurisdiction. So let's say that the West Virginia police then catch that bank robber. Because of this clause of extradition in the Federalism article of the Constitution, the West Virginia police will bring him back to Maryland so he can stand or she can stand trial for the crime that they committed. That's extradition or extraditing. The same thing, if you commit a crime in one state and then you run away and you go to some other state, we will send you back to that state to face the punishment for your crime. A great example of this is Ted Bundy, which I'm sure many of you saw that crazy Netflix movie they made this summer of all of his murders. Ted Bundy was a serial killer. If you don't know that, it like blows my mind and it freaks me out every time I watch that because he killed 30 plus people. In fact, we don't even know how many people he killed, but he killed in multiple states. So what happened was Ted Bundy was extradited from state to state to state, and face trial in each of those states that he had committed crimes in. That's because the extradition agreement that's seen here in Article 4 of Constitution. Okay, I'm just looking at a question here. What about parks and how they have... okay, so this is a good question. What about parks and how they have in-state people pay less to get in? So that's a really great question. And the other example of that I would give you is Here in a couple years, or maybe next year if you're a senior, in-state versus out-of-state tuition. Yeah, Elise, that's great. You guys, this is awesome. So here's why that one kind of is a little bit different, okay? Because wouldn't it be great if no matter where you went, you got in-state tuition, okay? And if you didn't realize this, when you go away to college, if you're not from that state, you have to pay a higher amount of tuition because you're from out of state. It sucks, okay? But you might be thinking, but wait a second, man, you just sat here and told me that privileges and immunities means that whatever privileges I give to my citizens in my state, in this case, in-state tuition or in-state rates for a state park, you have to give to everybody else. Yes, with some caveats. So what actually happens there, okay, is that with in-state tuition and with in-state park passes, basically, they get around that because the states say, look, the taxpayers in this state have paid a heavy burden to fund the state colleges and universities and to fund these state parks. And as a result, because they have been funding these their entire life via their taxes, we will give them a break on their in-state tuition or on their state parks. So they kind of skirt around privileges and immunities that way. It's never been challenged at the Supreme Court level. And so, I don't think that ever really will change, okay? So that's also why, again, I'll go back to the example, I live on the West Virginia border. WVU, West Virginia University, is only an hour from me, okay? Lots of Maryland students go there, but they don't get in-state tuition. So a lot of students will tell me, oh, I think I'm just going to move there next year and then I'll get in-state tuition. It doesn't work that way. Typically, to get in-state tuition, you have to have proof that you have lived in that state for at least 3 years. So like copies of bills or something like that. But that's how they get around that with in-state and out-of-state tuition, as well as the park piece. Because basically they say, look, you're a taxpayer. You've been paying into this your entire life. So we're going to give you in-state tuition. Okay, so does that answer your question? If it doesn't, just let me know, and I'll be more than happy to dive more into that. Okay, so then Article 5 is the amendment process. Okay, so it seems convoluted, but it's really not. Okay, there are 2 ways to propose amendments, and there are 2 ways to ratify those amendments. And you just remember the fractions 2/3 and 3/4, and you'll be good to go. So the 2 ways that Congress can propose an amendment. Number 1, they can propose an amendment. Congress can with 2/3 vote of each house. Okay. Now that is the way that almost every single amendment that we have in the Constitution, of the 27 amendments in the Constitution, has been proposed. Okay. The other way that an amendment can be proposed, although this is very rare for this to occur, but it has occurred in 1 or 2 cases, is 2/3 of state legislators can vote to call a national convention to propose an amendment. It's a little more convoluted, hence why we typically use the first option, where Congress, 2/3 of the members of Congress can propose an amendment. Now, once that amendment's been proposed, it has to be ratified, okay? So 2 ways it can be ratified. First is that 3/4 of all the state legislators can ratify it, okay? That is the way that every amendment that we have in our Constitution has been ratified. It's sent to the state legislators, the state houses across the United States, and they vote for it or against it. And then if we don't want to use that option, we can do 3/4 of state conventions. So we call specific constitutional conventions together to ratify something, okay? Again, the most common one is 3/4 of state legislators ratifying it. So when we look at the actual amendments to the Constitution, almost all of them have been proposed by 2/3 of the Congress and ratified by 3/4 of the state legislators. Now, you might be thinking, that's really hard to amend the Constitution. And you're right, okay? If the Constitution was easy to amend, our Constitution would be way longer. Over the course of the last 200-odd some years of American history, our Constitution has only been amended 27 times. However, there have been thousands of proposed amendments that have never been ratified. Why? Because it takes a high degree of voters and members of Congress or state legislators to actually get them to pass these amendments. Okay, that's kind of like a safety mechanism, because if we just made amendments very easy, then things could be passed on the whims of the population. So, for example, if we take early American history, we saw persons that were of African descent as less than people who were white, and specifically white males who were property owners. So if we would have had an easier amendment process, we could have very easily taken away the rights of those people. But we don't. It's a very hard process to get amendments passed, which is why in your lifetime, you guys have not seen a new amendment. The last new amendment to the Constitution would have been the early 90s with congressional pay raises. So it's been a long time since we've had an amendment to the Constitution. So that is Article 5, the amendment process. 2 more articles to go here, peeps. So Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause. And I love this little graphic because it illustrates the Supremacy Clause so well. So basically, the Supremacy Clause just is that the national government is supreme over the states, okay? So states can't pass a law that goes against the national government's law, period. Okay, and we can kind of stack things in order from top down of what's most supreme. So the highest law in the United States is the Constitution, but right below it are federal laws and treaties. Okay, your state constitution and your state laws are all below that. So let's say that, for example, in the early 1900s, the federal government passed a law. This is before the amendment. They passed a law called the Volstead Act, which banned alcohol. They would later make an amendment and then repeal that amendment, but that's a different story, okay? They passed the Volstead Act, which banned alcohol. States can't then go back and say, oh, sorry, no, we're going to allow alcohol in our state. Nope, you can't do that because the federal government is supreme. So, because of the Supremacy Clause, the federal government reigns supreme over the state governments, not the other way around. Now, if you think about the Articles of Confederation, it was flip-flopped, okay? And we just did a live stream on the Articles of Confederation the other night, so you can go back and look at that if you're struggling with that. But the idea here is that in the Articles of Confederation, the states had more power than the federal government. That all changed with the Constitution. The Constitution is now supreme. Now, I'll just throw a little plug in here. We get a Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court affirms that decision that the federal government's supreme, and it's McCullough versus Maryland. I'm not going to talk about it in this cast tonight, but we actually have a cast coming up on that either next week or the week after. So if you're struggling with some of those Supreme Court cases, those are coming up as well too. And then our last article is Article 7, ratification. Okay, so in order for the Constitution to become ratified, they had to have 9 of the 13 states ratify or vote on it, okay? And as soon as that 13th state voted or to ratify it in 1789, it became official, and our new government under the Constitution came to play, okay? So I have a question for you. First off, does anybody have any questions about any of the articles? Because that's the Constitution. And then if not, what are some of the principles of the Constitution, meaning some of the guiding ideas? I'm going to give you a second to write any questions you might have or guiding ideas here in the chat box, those principles of the Constitution that you know. I'm just curious to know what you might know. Egalitarianism, yep, that is definitely one. Popular sovereignty, yep, that's a good one. Limiting federal government, perfect, yep. Checks and balances, yep. This is a great group tonight. You guys are on fire. Power to the people, which I'd throw under popular sovereignty. Separation of powers, yeah. I mean, you guys are getting the idea here. Anything that doesn't allow a tyrant to rule, I would say that, yeah, your principles in general, make sure that that doesn't happen. And basically, they're all different protections because we just got rid of a king in Great Britain that was a tyrant. We didn't want to go through that again. So when we talk about principles of the Constitution, this is a pretty official list here. Now, some people can make arguments for some other principles, and that's fine. It's not like this is set in stone. But when we talk about principles of the Constitution, these are the 6 main ones that come up. Okay, so one is checks and balances and separation of powers. Another is judicial review, limited government, federalism, which I just got done talking about, laissez-faire, and popular sovereignty. And I'm going to take some time now, before we finish up here tonight, to go over each of these principles here briefly, okay? So let's talk about checks and balances and separation of power, okay? So with the idea of separation of powers, each branch is independent of one another. We don't want a tyrant. We don't want a dictator, okay? In a country where you have an autocracy, where one person rules, whether it's a dictator or a monarch, that person holds all the power. Whether it's the legislative, executive, and judicial, they hold it all in one person. That we don't have that in the United States. We have 3 separate branches with 3 separate different powers, okay? That comes from, does anybody know what political philosopher that comes from? That's another AP question for you to know. What political philosopher says we should have separation of powers? Give you a second here. If you know this, you're the smart cookie in the room tonight. Not Locke. Locke's natural law. Yep, there we go. Montesquieu. Okay, Montesquieu. Now, here's another question. Okay, this will really impress me if you know this too. Which of the Federalist papers talk about separation of powers? If not, we're going to have a stream on that next week. Not 11. Is this the point where people start? Yeah, 51, okay? Federalist 51. 10 is on factions. 51 is on separation of powers, okay? So, by creating 3 articles that talk about 3 separate branches, we separate those powers. But then we also have checks and balances, okay? Branches checking the power of another branch and balancing that power out. So that makes it so that we kind of have 3 co-equal branches, okay? No one branch is more powerful than another. So I really like this graphic because it shows you some of those checks and balances. So like when it comes to the build a law process, sure, Congress passes laws, but the check on that from the executive branch is that the president has to sign or veto those laws, okay? And then there's a check again on that power because Congress, let's say that they don't like that the president vetoed their law. They can override that veto with a 2/3 majority vote. But the judicial branch also has a check because if that law is kind of illegal or goes against our Constitution, they can rule it unconstitutional, meaning that it's done, okay? So there are checks and balances between all the branches that allow them to balance their power out, okay? And so that's what keeps not only power separated, but that power balanced. And that's the idea behind the first principle. The second principle is judicial review, okay? And this is what originates from the case Marbury versus Madison. Now, like I said, we're going to have a Supreme Court case stream next week that's going to go in depth with a couple of Supreme Court cases, one of which is Marbury versus Madison. But the idea is that Supreme Court under Chief Justice Marshall, in the early days of our country, declared that it had the right under the Constitution to perform judicial review, meaning that the judicial branch had the power to review laws and acts and decide whether or not they were constitutional or unconstitutional. Now, you're going to hear those 2 words all the time in this course. So what does that mean? So if something's constitutional, it just means that it agrees with the Constitution and it's okay, okay? Meaning that that law is okay, it can still exist. If the court rules that it's unconstitutional, that means the court saying this goes against our Constitution and thus it's now null and void, meaning it's done, okay? So, for example, going back to the thing I told you earlier tonight about gay marriage, when the Supreme Court decided in 2014 in the case Obergefell versus Hodges that the states that banned gay marriage were going against the Constitution, they declared that unconstitutional. And thus, all those laws across the United States that banned gay marriage were gone, just like that, with the click of a decision, or I should say the click of a pen on paper from the Supreme Court, those were gone. Why? Because of judicial review. Same thing, it's not just laws. So let's say a state passes a law that violates the U.S. Constitution, they can declare it unconstitutional. Let's say it's a school that takes some kind of action, like the school tells you every morning, you have to pray to God. Okay, well, that's a violation of your First Amendment right. The court's going to declare that unconstitutional, and that's going to be gone. The president signs an executive order. The court can review that and can decide if that's unconstitutional or not. But the idea, the power of judicial review, comes out of Marbury versus Madison. So when you see that case, just automatically think judicial review and the power of the courts to review the law. Some people argue, and I'll say that I'm kind of in that camp a little bit, that the Supreme Court and the courts in general may be one of the most powerful branches, if not the most powerful branch, because of the power of judicial review and the fact that they can rule laws unconstitutional, and those judges aren't elected. So that's judicial review. Next one is limited government. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, our government's not all powerful. Okay, there are limits to our government's power. They can't just do anything that they want. Okay, the Constitution is explicit, and we've talked a little bit about those, like Article 1, Section 8 tonight, on the things that the government can and can't do. But it also, our Constitution denies certain things. We deny the government the right to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, okay, unless in times of insurrection or rebellion. So what does that mean? If your teacher hasn't got to this yet, your teacher is going to be very impressed that you know this. So habeas corpus just means that when you are put in jail, you have the right to be told, A, what it is that you committed, or what crime you're accused of committing, and B, to be given a fair and speedy trial, okay? Well, if we suspend the writ of habeas corpus, it means that the government can throw you in jail for an extended period of time and never tell you what it is that you did. And the Constitution says that the government cannot do that unless in times of insurrection or rebellion. There's only one time in American history where it's been suspended, and President Lincoln suspended it for a brief period of time in the Civil War. That's an A-push thing, though, okay? But that power is denied to the government otherwise. The government cannot, okay, it's denied, cannot pass bills of attainder, which just basically is a fancy word to say that I'm passing a law that states that X, Y, Z person is guilty of committing this crime, okay? You can't do that. That's the role of the courts. The courts get to decide who's innocent or guilty. We can't pass laws that make someone automatically guilty. And then the last thing they cannot do is pass ex post facto laws, which is just Latin for after the fact, okay? So they can't pass a law today that says that yesterday it was illegal for all persons to ride yellow school buses and arrest everyone today that rode a yellow school bus yesterday. It seems super stupid, but I'm just giving you a really easy example here. So ex post facto means after the fact. So they can't pass a law today about something that was legal yesterday and put you in jail for it, okay? So those are three examples of limited government that are directly written in the Constitution. There are other ways that our government is limited as well, but those are some big ones to keep in mind. Then we get federalism. Well, I just talked about federalism with you, but it's, again, the division of power between the state and local governments, okay? The federal government handles certain things and the state government handles certain things. But really that comes out of the 10th Amendment, which really just says that if something's not listed in the Constitution, then it's reserved for the states. So, for example, nowhere in the Constitution does it talk about education. Well, that's a power that's then reserved for the states, hence why your schools are controlled and funded by your states, okay, if you're in a public school. So anything that's not in the Constitution, there's no mention of, that's something that the states get to control. That's the idea of federalism. Next one is laissez-faire, okay, which is French, okay? And basically, we as Americans prefer a laissez-faire economic policy, okay, which promotes free markets and limited government. Now, if you've taken AP World History or AP US History before, then you've heard of these things, or you should have. If not, and you will take those in the future, you will hear of this again. Laissez-faire is just a French word that translates to hands off, okay? So our government kind of keeps its hands out of the economy. The government doesn't tell you, if you're a factory owner, this is what you will produce and this is how much of it you'll produce, okay? Meanwhile, in like a communist or a socialist country, they do that, okay? Yes, basically capitalism. Yes, absolutely. Capitalism can only exist with laissez-faire. It means that the government allows you and I to make our decisions, okay? If I don't want to buy that version of bread anymore because it tastes like sawdust, I don't have to buy it anymore. And I have other options on the shelf. If I think Taco Bell sucks, because I really do think Taco Bell sucks, you should not eat that crap, I don't have to go to Taco Bell. I can make my decision and I can go across the street to KFC. Yes, this is good old American freedom, okay? This is why I'm like overweight too, okay? Because the biggest decision that I've made in my life today is that I'm not going to Taco Bell because it's disgusting, okay? So that's the idea of laissez-faire, hands off. Our government does not get involved with our economy. You and I get to decide what happens in our economy, what businesses we create, what products we buy, etc. And then the last one, popular sovereignty. I always tell my students just to break this word apart. Anytime you see popular, think people, and anytime you see sovereignty equals power. So it's literally power to the people. At the end of the day, you and I are the ones who are in control of our government, okay? You and I are the ones who get to decide if we want a certain person to be president of the United States, or we want another person to be president of the United States, or if we want that representative to be in or not to be in, because we get to elect. Now, that doesn't say that you and I always exercise those rights, because we know that lots of people don't exercise those rights, unfortunately, but they're there nonetheless. And you get the idea of populism. Okay, that kind of goes hand in hand with this, is basically it's the political philosophy supporting the rights of the average citizen and their struggle against the privileged elites. Okay, the elites, although we can make a run for it with the theory of elitism, okay, the elite theory, which you probably have talked about already in class this year, that the elites control, well, really are, because of popular sovereignty, you and I, as average everyday people, have the control of that as well, too. So that's the last principle of the Constitution. Those are the big ideas. Tonight, you should have got an understanding of what the articles were and then what the principles were. Does anybody have any questions on anything that I've done tonight? Anything you want me to go back over a little more in depth? I'm here to listen. So I'll give you a minute here before I close up shop for the night to ask any questions that you've got. Sorry, I'm getting a cold as well, too, so my voice is starting to get out. Well, I don't see anything else coming up. So just a quick reminder before we go. I'm going to scroll back to this, especially for those of you that kind of joined a little bit later. But we've got all these podcasts. We've got all these streams that are coming up this coming week and next week. And like I said, that's not even all the ones that are coming up next week. Next week, we have a big week. We officially launched last week with AP Gov, and we're kind of picking up more and more and more over the next couple of weeks. So if any of those things look good to you, love to see you there. I'll be hosting the one on powers. And if you're wanting to see what other ones are coming up, just go to the 501 website, look under AP US Government, and you'll be able to see everything there. If not, peeps, have a great night. Enjoy your Tuesday evening, what's left of it, and have a great rest of the week. Okay? Thanks, everyone.